Russia has no borders. This was the expansive and imperialistic idea behind Ruski Mir, or Russian world philosophy. But Ukraine has turned the tables on this idea and shown that Russia's vast border regions are undefended and in some ways undefendable. From the little blue men appearing in Belgorod to the drone strikes deep in Russian territory, the theatrical explosion above the Kremlin roof, and the mysterious fires happening at strategic facilities all over Russia, it seems that Putin's war to secure Russia's borders has actually had the effect of stripping Russia of any safety and security. Please subscribe to the channel if you found this video interesting so that other people can discover the great speakers we feature. And of course, do please consider becoming a patron if you like the work that we do. Konstantin Samoilov is a well-known YouTuber whose channel Inside Russia comments insightfully and thoughtfully on Russia's descent into authoritarianism over the last few years. But now, like many others, he's outside Russia with no idea of when he can return there. Konstantin, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back for the second time to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. Pleasure.
Well, let's start with this. We're going to start in two halves in this conversation. The first half is going to be about these big political issues and the developments in the war. The second half, I really want to explore the amazing and, as far as I can tell, unique work that you're doing in your club, in the organization that you've created, where you're living. And I'd love to explore that. Does that sound good? Should we start with the difficult stuff?
It's all is difficult, There's no easy stuff, let me tell you. But let's do it.
I think this idea of borders is fascinating, isn't it? Because Putin launched this war, whatever motivations he has. I think history will have a view on those, which perhaps at the moment is difficult for us to completely sort of decide what their role is. But the propaganda line was that the war was launched to defend Russia's borders, which were under threat. But we now see that those borders are largely undefended, with the incursion into Belgorod in particular, when, these insurgents, these little blue men rather than little green men, were sort of running around with armored vehicles for 48 hours, practically unchallenged.
Well, that's true. Very true. And the Belgorod incursion has shown, it's proved one more time that very sad state of Russian army, unprofessionalism, and basically it has showed that, first of all, the reasons for attacking Ukraine in the first place given to us on February 24th, 2022. And I'll remind you, there were two reasons. The first was to denazify Ukraine, and the second was to demilitarize Ukraine. And the reason of demilitarization was proven absolute lie, because, to demilitarize Ukraine, to make Russia safer, right? Because Ukraine, according to Putin, was posing a threat. Militarized Ukraine was posing a threat to Russia. Well, 15 months later, Ukraine, according to official propaganda, has been demilitarized, right? But in reality, the Ukrainian army is so much stronger, and the result, the green men roam into Russian territory freely, okay? And then what kind of demilitarization of Ukraine is that? What kind of safety that Russia has achieved over this 15 months? That's insane. Defense rests its case,
And we don't even need to touch on the denazification, because I think unless you're a turbo patriot or a sort of Z radical, I think this whole idea of denazification, most people understand that is pretty ludicrous. At least I hope most people understand that.
Jonathan, I personally lived in Ukraine for about a year, and I did not see one Nazi or fascist in Ukraine. I mean, the whole idea, like you said, is ludicrous to me. And despite that, many Russians believe that they are or they were Nazis in Ukraine. And when I confront such Russians, I ask one question usually: have you been to Ukraine yourself, personally? No, I have not. How do you know that? There are Nazis in Ukraine. Well, I heard it on TV. Defense rests its case, you know.
And it's difficult having a conversation with someone who then doesn't explore that, isn't it? You know, if they've got their information from TV, you know, it's. I know you talked about this in the first interview. At some point, you know, it's not necessarily worth your energy to try and engage that person because you may not make much progress in changing their mind.
I have tried my hardest because I am Russian. I was born and raised in Russia, and I feel it's my duty to give the truth to Russians as well as to the foreigners. And I am true to myself. I'm being honest with myself. I've tried, but you are right. That's difficult, and it doesn't work in most cases because people, if they're brainwashed, they're set to their views, and God knows what's going to happen to what needs to happen for their opinions to be changed.
That's the difficult question. I mean, I won't even ask that because I think that is even, you know, I haven't spoken to anyone who has a good answer to that. Although I am speaking next week to an expert in helping people recover from cults. So maybe he'll have an idea of how that process works. But I wanted to touch on the incursion into Belgorod and more widely, you know, the explosion of the drone over the Kremlin, which I think is now almost certainly was Ukrainian sort of special operations there to ensure that the Victory Day parade was toned down. I think that was the purpose of that. But what is the psychological impact of incursions like Belgorod, the strikes deep into Russia that we see by sort of drone attacks on strategic facilities, and you know, now these incursions? What do people, you know, people can't be unaware that this is happening, and what effect does it have on them?
Jonathan, you'd be surprised. Belgorod has definitely had much more effect on what Russians think. And the biggest effect, it has shown that there's something rotten in the kingdom of Dutch to many people. For the first time in 15 months, a government official of the highest caliber, Belgorod province governor, comes out and talks to people live, and people have questions to Russian army, and the governor also says, "Hey, you know what? You're not the only ones. I have a lot of questions to the Russian army." Again, this is the first time an act of disobedience and disagreeing with official propaganda, and that tells you that it's like an iceberg. You can only see 1/5 above the surface, and everything massive is underneath. So it just, the science above the surface, it shows you that underneath something big is happening. Okay, that's Belgorod. And the attacks on the Kremlin, they did not have much of an effect on the minds of the Russians because Russian propaganda has tried to downplay them, and they have pretty awesome job in downplaying. Okay, but you can't really downplay Belgorod. Okay, there's no way. There's so many people are involved, and they have evidence, they witness, they film, they spread what they filmed and things like that, and even people died. Kremlin is different. It's just a TV picture. Happened, they showed briefly, well, big deal, move on.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And I still don't know whether this is, clever Ukrainian psychological operations or not, but there are reports that when those so-called insurgents, who we know in reality are, trained and potentially even managed by Ukrainian special forces or secret Siloviki. I mean, I think it would be naive to think that there wasn't some, guidance there and approval. But The report is that they spoke to many villagers, many people on the ground. They didn't attack civilians. The reports are that when the Russian army did try to repel the insurgents, they were entirely indiscriminate, firing on the homes of civilians, shooting indiscriminately in to try and hit the insurgents with no mind to whether the local population would be safe or not. That shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, to anyone who watched the footage of Beslan and Novodost, it's been quite clear for a long time that no one gives a damn about civilian lives, whether through sort of just sheer incompetence or callousness or a mixture of both. But those stories are getting out. And the other story is that many villagers and people around who interacted with the insurgents asked how they could join. Now, this could be a clever psychological operation, or it could be the start of something quite interesting. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Jonathan, I cannot comment on that because I don't know what to tell you. I don't know whether it's a truth or not. One thing I can tell you, though, is if Russian government cared about Russian people, and let's suppose that Putin and his friends, his inner circle, who was making the decision to attack Ukraine, let's suppose they were afraid of Ukraine having so many Nazis and being so militarized, and then they were really afraid, which I don't believe they were. They just used it as excuse. But if they really were, and they cared for Russian people, they would have tried to solve this problem in a political way. They would never send troops to start attacking Ukraine and start killing Ukrainians, and Russian troops were getting killed in the process, and there were war, basically. They would never do that. Okay, so they don't care about people. That's a fact. The locals trying to join, trying to rebel, I simply have no clue. I don't know.
It's very difficult to know, isn't it? And I think you made a really fascinating point a few minutes ago, and that was with the governor of the Belgorod Oblast, who this first sign of dissent. And we've seen that whenever that happens, let's say in the Khabarovsk Krai or some other region, whenever a governor goes against Moscow, that is the end of their career. At best, at worst, they have an unfortunate incident with a window or something. So he's taking a real risk. But the Western media and social media get fixated on someone like Pregosian. And, Pregosian said something that's going to upset Grandpa. Pregosian is completely off script. I don't quite buy that, because if he was completely off script, he wouldn't last very long. And he's almost set up in this role of a kind of holy fool, so he can say things that nobody else can. I think actually the point you made is significant. It's when actual officials who are within the structure start rebelling. That is a far more interesting indicator.
I hands down agree with you. Prigozhin is not an independent politician. I don't even know who he is. He's a political project by Vladimir Putin. That's basically it. But the governor of Belgorod province is completely different situation. That he's a public figure. He's one of the top managers of Russia, so to speak. He's in charge of Russia's border region. So.
And if more join that, then that's going to become quite difficult to spin their way out of it. While we're on incursions, and we're going to move off this topic, I think, shortly, but there's a really tricky one, of course, and psychologically, it's quite impactful what we're talking about. The next thing that comes in the war could have a far bigger psychological impact, and that is potentially the siege of Crimea, or even the retaking of part of Crimea, the perhaps total destruction of the Kerch Bridge. All these things are now, they're not just, impossibilities, they're highly probable. Losing Crimea, I think, would potentially have a huge psychological impact on Russians. And the really difficult question I want to ask here, I think, is that many people in 2014 applauded the annexation of Crimea. In my view, what they were applauding was not a resetting of historical wrongs, but what they were embracing was illegality and lawlessness. Even if they didn't realize that, they were embracing a new state of affairs where there is no rule of law. That, as we now see, has come back to bite everyone badly. That's my interpretation of it. Do many Russians yet realize that by embracing illegality, they then, that phrase, sow the wind, reap the whirlwind, that what they're experiencing now is a direct result of their acquiescence and even active support of the regime in 2014?
A lot of Russians have been realizing, not say that a lot of Russians have been changing their picture of Putin and his government and Russia and what Russia has done and so forth. I would disagree with you on when it was happening in 2014. Many people, most people, they did not realize that there was lawlessness, illegality happening. They were sold absolutely a different idea that Crimea was being rescued from Bandera, followers, rescued from the illegality that was happening in Ukraine at the time. And this is why most Russians embraced Crimea. But in my opinion, since that, many have sobered up.
And part of that narrative, of course, is that, if you're a Russian speaker in Donbass, Mariupol, Odessa, Crimea, if you're a Russian speaker in these territories, then somehow it makes you Russian. I mean, culturally, we know there was a lot of sympathy for Russian culture there. I mean, there absolutely was. And prior to 2014, very low support, actually, for joining NATO, and still very, very strong historical sympathy for Russian culture. And as you know, I can speak Russian, and I've spoken to many people, including, becoming friendly with families who fled Mariupol. And of course, there is this distinction. You can be sympathetic to Russian culture. You can have Russian as your primary language. It does not make you politically Russian. I think that idea was misunderstood in 2014. Are people coming around and really starting to understand that, Russophone people are not necessarily part of Ruski Mir or Russian as a state?
That was a huge mistake that many Russians made, and they still make that mistake. Somehow they thought that people in Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk provinces, in Odessa were Russian. They weren't, because, again, I have been to Ukraine many times, and spent close to a year there, mostly in Odessa, in Kiev, in Zaporizhia, and in Kharkov. And I also traveled to Donetsk, because Donetsk, not too far from my hometown of Rostov, 2-hour drive. That's not far at all. And I traveled to attend football games, ice hockey games. What I found there was 100% Russian culture, Russian language, and people that did not differ much from me, from the people that I saw around myself in Rostov. Absolutely same. Gosh, in Rostov, we even speak Russian with southern Ukrainian accent, So we even our language didn't differ. But one thing I didn't see there, the Russians. I saw Ukrainians that spoke Russian, Ukrainians that were very friendly to Russia and the Russians. I did not feel like I was in a different country culturally, but I was, because everyone was Ukrainian, and everyone clearly, it was not even a question, some people in Ukraine thought themselves as Russians, but guess what? They left for Russia a long time ago. It was fairly easy to relocate, to move permanently from Ukraine to Russia, to get Russian permanent residency, then citizenship. And I know a few people who did that. They felt they were Russian, and that's okay. If you want to do something like that, just go ahead and move. You're free. But the ones in Donetsk, Lugansk, and everywhere else, they were Ukrainian citizens. They were Ukrainians, 100%. Somehow Russians thought it was different. Okay, and many still make that mistake.
And it's not unique there. I mean, even even especially in Britain, we have that challenge, and the English have to be constantly reminded that the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish, we share a common language and we share a lot of aspects of common culture, but there are distinct differences, and people will be insulted if if you call a Scotsman English and so on. And yeah, these are complex, difficult questions that people have to think hard about. I think that's absolutely fascinating what you said there. Let's turn to the economy, because we've got two other topics we want to cover, and I really want to sort of get to your club and society. But you've also written posts and you've done videos on the state of the Russian economy, and this is absolutely kind of fascinating as what's happening, and it's probably the least understood and the least transparent aspect of it. Is Russia able to break the sanctions? Is it getting commodities out to countries like China, India? Is it getting weapons in from South Africa? What's the state of people's wealth, people's personal wealth and comfort? These are, for us, a kind of black box. We don't have too many answers on this.
Well, Jonathan, that's a very complicated topic, and let's break it into separate questions. Let me give you an overview of how I see Russian economy performing. I'm an economist by trade, so that's by far my favorite topic. I follow Russian economy. I have followed in the last 15 months. I've made forecasts. Some came true. Some, I made mistakes, and I understand what kind of mistakes now. But let me tell you the current state. I think that what has been happening to Russian economy is a disaster. I call it economic tsunami, and the water is here. Tsunami takes a while. Once earthquake happens on the bottom of the ocean somewhere far, nothing happens on the islands thousands miles far, okay, at the same time. But tsunami, the wave was born, and the wave travels, and it's going to take some time for the wave to reach the island, and it's going to destroy everything on the island. It's done deal, if you know what I mean. And that's exactly what I think happened in Russia. And I also compare it to Titanic. Titanic was hit by the iceberg. It did not sink immediately. And people got out on the upper deck and they saw Titanic going forward and iceberg floating somewhere behind. And everyone was like, whew, thank goodness we're safe, But in reality, the damage was done. And underneath compartments, they started getting flooded. And it was only a matter of time, minutes, until so much water would get inside and Titanic would start angling and then would go down. It took 2 hours, 30 minutes or so. But for the first 40 minutes, people on Titanic lived as nothing happened. They went back to doing their thing, dancing, eating, conversing, sleeping, whatever. They could care less. But at some point, the signs of troubles they showed, and we know the results. So back to Russian economy. So if I can tell you a few things, all right, in a very nutshell. Russian economy is not doing well. There are a few things you need to know, and you will understand everything. First of all, Russian economy has always depended on exports of natural resources. That's the foundation of well-being of the country, foundation of its budget. 46% of Russia's budget consisted of selling natural gas, oil, and metals. Okay, and Russia has lost its bread makers: oil, natural gas, and metals. We all know that Europe does not buy Russian oil. It's forbidden. We all know that whoever else wants to buy Russian oil, they cannot pay more than $60 per barrel. Therefore, Russia does not make much money at all from taxes. And we all know that natural gas is not supplied by the existing pipelines. They've been destroyed to Europe. The best paying, the most stable customer you can come up with anywhere, okay? So basically, Russia shot itself in both feet. And you cannot sell natural gas to anyone else because Russia does not have ports to liquefy and ship it. Okay, it needs to have pipelines. There's a pipeline to China, but very limited amounts of gas, and Chinese are not the best customers, far from the best. So basically, Russia has lost its biggest bread maker. Okay. Second, the spendings of Russian budget have increased tremendously by over 50% in the last year, in the last 15 months. One simple reason: the war. The war is costing lots of money. Military industrial complex is working 24/7. And I think also there's lots of money being stolen in the process, but that's Russia.
That was
Number
going to be
three.
one of my questions. This war isn't just a war; it's a massive money-making opportunity for certain people within the
Oh
structure.
yeah. Let's get to that after I finish with one economy question. So number three, Russia has been placed upon under sanctions of all possible kinds, and now it's the most sanctioned country in the history of the humankind. All Western companies have left Russia, small and large, and over 1,000 companies have left, including the giants like Siemens, General Electric, McDonald's, Apple, Microsoft, you name it. Everyone's left. They have taken their capital away from Russia, their jobs away from Russia, their taxes away from Russia. They have taken everything away from Russia. There is no capital inflow. All investors have left, both Western and Russian. Russian banks cannot finance any infrastructure projects, any projects. And the only industry that is well right now is the one that supports weapons, military industrial complex. Number four, around 3 million people have left Russia. There are different estimations, but they range from 1 to 2, 3 millions. And I think it's closer to 3 millions, okay? And I'm one of them. I'm seeing everything with my own eyes, and what's happening around me is a disaster for Russia because, I'm not seeing physical laborers here. I'm seeing doctors, university professors, IT people, IT specialists, engineers, teachers, people with high education, 100%. Everyone who has left Russia, cream of the crop, businessmen, professionals, you name it. Second, bread making, taxes. Those people were generating lots of taxes in Russia, and they were adding so much value to Russian economy and to Russian society, and they're gone. This is a huge blow to the economy. And number five, so many Russians were killed, Russian men. They are not telling us. The last time we heard the number 5,900, which is, obviously it's a lie. And it was on September 21st of 2022, almost 9 months ago. Okay. And so all those Russian men who were killed or injured, how many people injured? How many people have become disabled? And that also is a blow to the economy. So basically, all you have to know is these 5 points. And the result at this point in May 2023, Russian consolidated budget is in red and deficit by 6.1 trillion rubles. In federal budget is in the red by 3.4 trillion rubles. Now, just 5 months ago, when they were actually creating the forecast, the plan for the budget deficit for the upcoming year, 2023, they set the number of 3 trillion ruble deficit for the entire 2023. Right now, in 4 months, because we have data up till April, we are 400 million rubles, 400 billion rubles over that number, okay? And the forecasts that at this point already we are over 7 trillion rubles budget deficit, just federal budget, and it's not enough. If they take liquid reserves that Russia has right now, it's already not enough to cover that. If that is not a disaster, what is? So basically, that's in very nutshell my understanding how Russian economy is performing. And this is a current performance. There are also trends that are absolutely devastating, okay? People that can create, they can support economy, they can create value, add value, create products, taxes, they're gone. Therefore, Russia will be losing in the future. Now, exports of oil and natural gas, they're gone. People died in Ukraine already. They're not going to be returned. So Russian economy is going to be performing worse and worse and worse. And even if the war in Ukraine is prolonged from now, if let's say Ukraine does not achieve fast victory right now, but a few more months and Russia will be falling apart from the inside because it simply does not have economic means to support itself.
This is exactly what I wanted to hear, because I've heard military analysts, and let's face it, the military analysts have got so much wrong over the last 2 years, but I've heard some of them say Russia could continue fighting for years. It's a huge country, it has infinite resources. That seems to me a ludicrous assertion, and what you've just said here makes far, far more sense.
Well, one thing though, this is May 2023, and Russia, they say that Russia can fight for years. And in Belgorod, troops can be found that not Russian. Okay, so how does that go along with the statement that Russia can go on like that for years? Okay, what about Belgorod? And that's not the first time, by the way.
And of course, we know that Ukrainians are good strategists. We know they've been thinking a lot and planning a lot for this so-called spring-summer offensive. This incursion could be one of many. If their aim is to decisively defeat Russian forces, if their aim is to keep Western arms flowing, but to lose as few Ukrainians as possible, then of course, having massive incursions and throwing these Russian legions en masse in different areas right across the front is super smart and super economical. To my mind, they might do the same with Belarus legions and try to destabilize that front as well. Maybe Chechnya will go up in flames. And if they're intelligent, they will turn Russia's fragility and the rigidity of the system against it and, help to foster conflagration right across Russia's borders. You've got Armenia, Azerbaijan, you've got Georgia. There are so many areas where this whole stack of cards could collapse.
It's really hard to disagree with you.
Well, that's something to watch. I mean, none of us can know what's going to happen there. The last question on the economy was the one we sort of touched on there about the money-making scheme. We know that in the Olympics, in the construction of the Kerch Bridge, huge chunks of those budgets were stripped out by, layers of, I'm going to say it, parasites, layers of parasites. The war machine, I mean, we'd be naive to think that this wasn't happening on a massive scale.
Jonathan, this is where I usually have hard time explaining Russia to foreigners. okay? Because your understanding on how the country's economy and how government works is completely different from what is really happening, has been happening in Russia, okay? I know well what is American dream, okay? And then I think it's pretty universal for the Western countries. American dream is to work hard, harder and smarter than anyone else, to work hard enough to create good product, to create value, create something good for people so they come in and buy it and enjoy it, and then you make money and you become rich and you become happy, you have good life, and you keep on building your business and you become big in business. And this is American dream, right? You can achieve anything you want to. Russian dream is completely different, and it goes along with what you just said. Russian dream is to get a certain position within the government that allows you to control money flow from budget onto downwards, because everything in Russia is financed by Russian budget, okay? And so you control the money flow, and you just take a little bit out of it, you reroute it into your pocket, or all of it, depending, and your pocket is, gets fatter and fatter and fatter. You take that money and you don't spend it in Russia. You transfer it out of Russia to the United States, to London, to the Virgin Islands, to Cyprus. You take your family and you move your family to Miami, Sunny Isles, or, Beverly Hills, or Belgravia, or,
You're
a
hinting
decent
here at
place.
Solovyov, aren't you? Solovyov and
Uh,
his secret
Lake
family.
Garda, perfect example. Lake Garda, Solovyov, he's having a great time in Italy, right? But working for the Russian government. Another another example is another talk show, Malasheva. She lived in New York, and she used to fly to Russia to film a show, and then she would fly back to her home in New York. Her kids live in New York, Look at Russian politicians. Sergei Shoigu, Sergei Lavrov, that not just like a small guys, but the top dogs, the big guys, and start asking questions about their families, and you'd be surprised. Okay, so that's the Russian dream. Okay, and anywhere there's budget spending, there's an understanding that there will be people who control the budget spending, and this is why they basically work for the government. They have power to control the budgets. They have power to steal, basically. That's in very nutshell. I don't even know how to explain how Russia works in easier words to understand. Okay, I hope you understand. But all foreigners that I speak to, they have different mindset. They don't understand how it works. In Russia, it's completely different from the West.
There's
Okay, so
I read
until
very early
recently,
on when
because
I was,
now,
yeah,
because of the
sorry.
sanctions, I don't really know what's going to happen to all the property and the families abroad. Well, I know that some people have been sent back to Russia, deported, and property seized, but still in the process,
There's a Gogol quote from one of his povesti or stories in the 19th century, and it's about a landowner who's sitting on the porch of his property, and he's got a big fat mosquito on his arm, bloated with blood, and he's just letting it suck his blood. And someone says, why are you letting that insect, suck the blood out of you? He says, well, this one's not hungry anymore, so I'll leave him here. But if I swat him, there are 100,000 hungry ones that could take his place.
No, no, and no. You know what? I've been hearing about that for so long, and this what usually Russians, regular people, say about the politicians. Well, let's replace a politician. Let's get rid of this governor or this government or the president and get a new one. Oh no, we shouldn't do that. Why? because these people are not hungry anymore. And, the new ones will be hungry. Exactly what you said. But that is such a mistake and misconception. It actually has brought us into the situation where we are in 2023 in this war with Ukraine, because those people are always hungry. The more they get, the hungrier they become. Okay, it doesn't work that way. They never get satisfied. They want more and more and more. I mean, just look at them. They've been in power for over 20 years. How rich are they? Billions over billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and they're still hungry.
That sounds so truthful. Yeah, absolutely. And what it implies is that it's no good just replacing individuals. It's no good just replacing Putin. It is systemic change that's required. And that brings us on to the third topic we're going to discuss, and that is the work that you're doing to create the group that you've done in your adopted country to try and find a new way for Russians to communicate and organize. And I'd love to hear how it's going, but also how your original conception for it has been evolving and changing over time.
It has evolved quite a bit. Let me tell you a story of my group. It's called International Tashkent Breakfast Club. I left Russia suddenly. I had not planned on leaving. Well, I planned on leaving in general, but announced mobilization was kicking the butt, so to speak. So I had 36 hours to leave, and I left. And that was absolutely devastating. For the first days, I basically was feeling like my life was over, and I had lost everything. I lost everything I had in Russia. I was building a career, a job, assets, money in the future, because I had my future in Russia. I had planned things, and all of a sudden I realized that that's over, all over. It was an incredibly depressing, bad feeling. And at one point, I was just, for a few days, I was just walking around from morning till night, listening to music, trying to somehow catch my breath. And in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, I saw thousands of Russians, just like me, doing the same thing, walking, sitting at the cafes, without any goal, just sitting there drinking coffee and trying to. I mean, you can see this thing. You can smell it in the air when the person is grieving and something is not right. So I decided to get people together, to organize some kind of a support group. It's like, anonymous alcoholics. A few people get together and they say, I'm an alcoholic. Oh, you know what? I'm not alone. You're not alone. We're in together this, and it helps. Okay, so I started getting the exiles, the refugees together. And no one came for a couple of weeks. And then I decided to do shout-outs every morning in numerous Telegram channels and so forth. And I was offering everyone to buy breakfast and to buy porridge, oatmeal, coffee. And people started coming. This one person showed up, another person showed up. And at one point, a couple of weeks, I think 3 weeks into me starting doing this, 9 people showed up, and it was a breakthrough. And it was such a relief for all of us to sit in the circle and speaking, telling their stories, just getting that stuff out was so therapeutic. I saw people getting back to life again. It was incredible. And that's what I've been doing ever since. At first, I was getting people together as a support group so we could help each other. First 6 months were incredibly difficult. There's a psychological concept called culture shock, and that's what we were going through. At one point, I realized that each one of us was feeling like the worst in our lives. So I found a psychologist, a fellow refugee, and I started organizing large meetings, like 50 plus people. And a psychologist would get out and have a lecture on how to deal with pain and depression and things like that. And then bit by bit, it started getting better. About New Year, I figured that what I was doing was not enough. And I met a Ukrainian family here in Tashkent, and I decided that I needed to start attempting at least to bridge Russians and Ukrainians together to show the world and the Ukrainians that not all Russians are bloodthirsty, um, how to say it mildly, beasts. And there are some Russians who support Ukraine, who are against the war, and at least have some common sense, and logic and empathy and love in their hearts. And that's how Russian-Ukrainian Tashkent Breakfast Club started. Ukrainians started showing up more and more. Now we have a few families from 15 to 20 Ukrainians. They attend on a regular basis. And other nationals started showing up from Israel, from the United States. Of course, we have local Uzbeks. And now we have a group of about 500 people. There are a couple groups that I also know were not organized by me, but we are in close contact. We're friends all here. And I feel like this group is evolving because we're becoming more than just a support group, more than just, bridging Russian and Ukrainians. That kind of goes without saying at this point, okay? We don't even, like, at first, Ukrainians were showing up. I would, stand up and introduce them, and I would say, hey, these people came from Mariupol, these people came from Kharkov and from Ukraine. Now we don't say that because we're just friends, but we definitely start, we're all angry because we were forced to abandon our life, and we understand that our country is no more the country that we loved, and we are full of energy. We are active, okay? We are smart, most of us at least, and we feel like we're becoming a force.
And from, this support network that you've talked about, getting people through the culture shock, getting people beyond just surviving to start living again and, developing themselves, even getting the energy to invest in, training and new careers and so on. Do you feel that has still got, there's still a lot of evolutionary journey to go? And at some point, are people going to start, or is this even already happening, start talking about what their visions for Russia are, start dreaming about returning and actually making a change? Because it seems to me many Ukrainians became politically active and aware at the time of Maidan, maybe the older generation in the Orange Revolution. And many people have said that they couldn't care less about politics up until that point. But suddenly it was like a spark, like a catalyst. Do you think that these civil society or these social groupings could morph into something more and start to form the basis of a future civil society?
It's not a matter of could morph into something more. They have morphed into something more. The support group idea is still alive and kicking because we still have new people coming to Russia and joining us every single week. This morning, I just returned from the breakfast. There were 2 new people fresh off the boat from Moscow. And they were asking questions. Oh, how do I open a bank account? Where do I find, I need a dentist. Where do I find a children's doctor? How to rent an apartment. And we have everyone in the group right here. I just point a finger, say, hey, this guy owns a real estate company. He'll help you out. You'll get an apartment within a couple of days. Hey, we have a doctor from Russia who works here employed, here's the number. Go and talk to her. Oh, we have someone's looking for an employee, there's a job opening. Just look at this way. This kind of things happening. But we have morphed into something else because you're spot on. Okay. Most of us, we were always politically inactive, just like many Ukrainians were. And we realized that due to our inactivity, Russia is at the point where it is right now. And that is no more. Like I said, each one of us is full of energy, is very active, is smart, fairly young, and we have been morphing. Definitely discussing, and I can't really say things publicly here, you know what I mean. But we're definitely not a support group any longer. Not just a support group any longer, I should say that.
I mean, that's fascinating to hear. And as the years go by, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how these changes impact. I think what's fascinating, I had a recent interview with a Russian academic who's been studying the transition of elites in Russia. And I think many of us struggle to understand how we got to this place. And we struggle with the media narrative that it's all Putin and just a handful of individuals. What her research pointed to is that 60% of the Siloviki, apparatchiks, key cultural figures, those who are in what would be called the establishment, 60% can trace the source of their power, prestige to the USSR. So there wasn't this fundamental change of the old guard. That helps to explain a lot. What you're doing, I believe, I hope, is that you're creating, the foundations that hopefully will remove entirely that generation. And it seems to me they have to be removed if there's going to be progress.
Not much else I can say. I totally agree with you. That generation is somehow, the entire generation is still in love with the USSR and Siloviki. Definitely, they were grieving that they lost so much when the USSR was destroyed, and the people gained, but Siloviki, they lost a huge deal. They lost everything. Okay. And then it took them about 25 years to come back and to get their revenge. And boy, they're back with a bang. And they're doing their revenge you wouldn't believe. This is exactly what we spoke of this morning. It's really hard to believe for us younger folks that those times of the USSR are back, and even worse than in the USSR, because when Soviet Union fell apart in early 90s, we were so full of hopes, we were so happy, and they were saying, never again we will allow anything like this to happen. Never again. The government will get so powerful, it will start oppressing us, telling us what to do. Never. Oh, this is not even, this is unthinkable. We will not let it happen. 30 years later, history repeats itself.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that the optimism in the 90s was tremendous, and the state was weak. That caused a lot of problems, but younger people had opportunities. They were discovering, well, at least in the sort of certain circles, not everyone, but they were discovering repressed literature, both Russian and foreign films, and so on. It is a kind of extraordinary period. My last question, and I know we're out of time, and this is probably could be quite a depressing one. Do you think Putin, when he does go, is it going to be clean, or like me, do you fear a kind of fairly messy end to his regime?
I have thought a lot about it. I do not see any possibility of a clean change. I am very afraid of a messy change, of messy transition of power. you can clearly see the science already. Prigozhin has a large private army. There are 17 more private armies in Russia. They're not advertised, but they were created recently and they're being beefed up. Even Rogozin is openly speaking of creating his own private army. I mean, what do people get private armies for? Let's think about that, right? Let's ask this question. For something that's coming up, very fast, for the power fight, for the power struggle. And unfortunately, I think that it's going to be messy, it's going to be bloody, and nothing good is in the future for Russia, at least in the short-term future.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is very probable, and it's very easy to imagine that, especially as you were, someone who's observed in the 90s when oligarchs had genuine power, when they had their own security forces. And, not many in the West will have seen it, but if you've seen those videos of hostile takeovers of companies where they turn up with their small private armies and basically, a sort of literal corporate raiding, it's very easy to imagine.
Jonathan, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's going to be 10 times worse, because
Yeah, 100 times worse. Yeah.
What happened back then, Boris Yeltsin was the ultimate power in the country, and he was not disputed by anyone. Okay, what was happening, what you're saying, the private security forces, they weren't armies back then, they were like a bunch of bodyguards, security forces, as we call security companies, we call them. They were still acting within the framework of law, and they were not above KGB, they were not above co-ops. Okay, they had lots of power, but they were constrained. What's going to happen now? These people will start fighting over for ultimate power, and that's a different kind of fight, ruthless, bloody, and with possible Russia falling into different pieces, possibility of Russia falling into different pieces.
That's a distinct possibility. Putin has now mentioned it twice, and I was speaking to a journalist who's actually had conversations with Peskov, and in a private event, she asked him, "What does the elite most fear in Russia? Most fear, not NATO, not even Navalny. What they fear," he said, "is Russia falling apart." And I think that is the sort of psychosis, that's the paranoia at the heart of the regime. But it's something they themselves will bring about.
You know why? Because it's real. Because Navalny, not a real threat. Because NATO, oh, come on, it's a fairy tale. But Russia falling into pieces, that's very real now. And they have created this situation themselves, okay? And they understand it might happen, and there's a great probability of happening. That's why they're paranoid. And they also know that once it starts happening, Kremlin loses all control of everything, okay? There will be no Kremlin's power anywhere, and all oligarchs will be stripped of their money, belongings, some might even get hurt bad, if you know what I mean. And this is a real threat. This is a real possibility in Russia now.
But Konstantin, that's where we have to end it. This has actually been, one of the most fascinating conversations I've had. I think we've touched on so many things, but it's built up to a terrifying but entirely plausible story of the future. But it's also heartening to hear what you're doing and what you're achieving with your Breakfast Club and how it's evolved. And I'm incredibly grateful that you've spent the time to share your thoughts and insights with the audience.
Thank you so very much for having me, Jonathan. It's a pleasure. Let's do that again in the future.